apartheid was what you ate and what you drank, what you breathed every day. The school you went to, the segregation, the places where you stay, white only,
Do we have voluntary yielding of land? What's the situation in terms of land?
Yes, the South African government has put in place mechanisms to deal with the land issue. Just to give you a bit of background, the apartheid regime had a policy of declaring certain areas white areas, and if in that area that they had declared white there were black residents, they would then be forcibly removed. Their land would then be taken, and it would be incorporated into this area that has been declared white. So this has been happening right since 1948. And just to give you an idea, the blacks who are in the majority in South Africa, by the way blacks, I'm including Indians, coloreds and so forth, they occupied, or legally, or in terms of the law made by the apartheid parliament, they were entitled to occupy only 13% of the land, and the rest belonged to whites. And so there were a lot of communities that were displaced, and this then resulted in bitterness and so on. And when the new government took over, there was one of its priorities was to rectify these errors. And so what they then did was to set up the mechanism. They, for example, put together a law that governed the processes that were aimed at rectifying these mistakes which were made by the previous government. And for example, in this law there is provision made for the Land Commission. Now this commission is responsible then for processing claims. So according to the law, communities that were displaced have to make claims. They've got to put in claims for their land, and these are submitted to this commission. This commission then investigates these claims, and then the final decision is then taken as to what's going to happen, how the people will be compensated. Now, it's a very difficult process because in some instances these lands have been turned into prosperous farms, and there's a lot of agricultural activity taking place,
right,
and so on this land. And so in some instances there are people, the current owners are resisting, but there are others who are saying, well, we acknowledge that this land was not acquired correctly, and they are prepared, the government at the moment is prepared to buy them out. And there have been cases where the current owners have accepted the offer the government made to them to buy the land back from them and to give it back to its current owners.
Now who's buying from whom in this case?
It's the government. The government is taking up the responsibility of buying that land back. In some instances, negotiations are entered into with the previous owners of the land, and in some instances, some communities opt for monetary compensation rather than be relocated to the land, and this is governed by a whole lot of factors. In some communities, you find that the current owners are still steeped into the old apartheid tactics, and you know, for example, in areas such as Ventersdorp and so on, which are right-wing strongholds, you find that there is a lot of resistance, and unfortunately you would find that there are people trying to sabotage the process and so on. So, but the government is determined to go ahead and to speed up the process.
But what about the people? Are they patient?
In some areas people are impatient, and there are cases where people were, the removal was very traumatic, and there are scars, and there's a lot of bitterness, and in some instances there are people, some members, communities feel very strongly that you know, the way they were removed or what, it should perhaps be dealt with in the courts, and that that the people who removed them should be punished and so on. So in some communities feel very, very bitter about this, and also because this is a systematic way of handling and dealing with this complex issue, it tends to be slow, and there are some communities are becoming impatient, and they say that the government is taking too long, and they don't see why the current government does not treat the people who are occupying that land in the way in which they themselves were treated by the previous government.
Whites who grab land from the blacks or who kicked blacks out of their land and took it for themselves still have land. I mean, that land is still owned by those white people. I'm not so sure whether I can compare the land question in the Namibian case with that of Zimbabwe. Political misappropriation of land, it is the same in character. But in terms of the nature of policies and programs that are put before land, I don't think they were the same. Because our colonial masters never promised us that they will do this for us in order for us to solve the land issue.
Right.
Which did.
Yes.
And also in terms of constitution, I think our constitution was drafted in Namibia with an input by Namibians. They spent weeks and months discussing this constitution thoroughly in Windhoek. Of course, maybe they got experts, you know, to help them draft, but nevertheless, it was discussed by the people, it was adopted by the people, it was redrafted, and, you know. So, and as I said, with regards to the land policy that we have, I think for Namibia that was something that emanated from the people themselves. I'm not trying to insult Zimbabwe and say theirs did not emanate from themselves, but I'm just saying we know the Lancaster
agreement, yes, of the British, yes.
And so one cannot, it is on the basis of that, because that formed the basis on which this land was supposed to be tackled, and promises that were made and promises that were not met, and then frustrations that resulted from that, whereby, I mean, South Africa never promised us that after independence we are going to do you this, and in terms of land policy, this is, they never promised us to even help us to start relooking at the land question, really.
So are you hoping that there will be a voluntary surrender of land in the case of Namibia?
Of course, there are some white farmers who have sold a bit of their land. The issues that one has to look at with Namibia land issue is that we have absentee landlord. Apartheid is a system that has been in place since 1940s, introduced to Namibia. And I mean, to just think that 12 years of independence is enough time to wipe out that system that was uprooted. I mean, because apartheid was what you ate and what you drank, what you breathed every day. The school you went to, the segregation, you know, the places where you stay, white only, you know, white areas, black areas, colored areas, white areas, you know, It was a question of color all over the place. And of course, the income disparities that also play a role, because you cannot just say a person who never had education, who cannot hold a certain job, they will never be able to afford to send their children to a certain school, which was former white school, because the price maybe, or some other things, distance maybe, and you cannot just expect that. Because we have this Areas Act which define that if you are white, you wear. In Namibia it went so far that in some areas you can find that a certain area is predominantly German, German-speaking white people, English-speaking white people. The other area is Afrikaner dominant. It went so far even into white ethnicity.